पॉलिसी बाजार पर 1 करोड़ रुपए का टर्म लाइफ इंश्योरेंस केवल 450 रुपए महीने से शुरू। Wow.
But let me go straight across to Dr. Isaac Bogoch. Sir, thanks very much for being with us. In your mind, what exactly is it about this strain of COVID which makes it immune or potentially immune or gives it the ability to evade the vaccines that we've been using?
You know, in all fairness, I think I share less of a concern about that particular issue and more of a concern that when we're dealing with a population like China, obviously we don't want to see anyone succumb to this illness, or we don't want to see anyone get ill from COVID, regardless of where they are on the planet. But we know that China has, relative to other places in the planet, very few people who have been infected and have recovered from infection. If we look at where we're at right now, sadly, that's changing dramatically and will change dramatically over the next few weeks and months ahead. In addition to that, they also have relatively, based on the data that emerged from China, relatively poor uptake of vaccinations, especially booster vaccinations, and especially in populations that are more vulnerable for severe infection. So when you combine the lack of protection from vaccinations plus the lack of protection, and again, I'm not saying we want people to be infected. We obviously don't. We just can't ignore that, as you pointed out earlier, you do get some protection from recovery from infection. And between a lack of protection from the vaccinations plus recovery from infection, they're at risk for a significant COVID wave, which is what they're seeing right now. I'd remind people one other point, that the vaccines that we've seen, the vaccines to date, have continued to stand up and continue to provide tremendous protection against more severe manifestations of the virus, such as hospitalization and death. And that transcends all variants, Alpha, Delta, Omicron, the various sublineages of Omicron. The vaccines continue to do that. Yes, of course, we've lost some of that protection against infection and onward transmission, but they still do a remarkable job in protecting against severe infections. That's why it's so important to get those vaccines out.
Dr. Bogoch, is there a real chance or a real belief increasingly that air travel out of China needs to be curtailed completely?
No, I think that's completely the wrong thing to do. We've seen time and time again how that policy does not fail or does not successfully curb transmission globally. And if you look at most places, not every single place, but the vast majority of places around the world that had travel restrictions in the absence of other measures, the virus and the variants of concern make their way in one way or another. We saw various travel restrictions placed on Southern Africa, Botswana and South Africa, for example, when the Omicron variant was discovered about a year ago now, and that did absolutely nothing to curb the spread of Omicron globally. Those travel restrictions are punitive, and in fact, they probably do more harm than good. I mean, think about if you're in a country that you're discovering new variants, you're not going to share your genetic sequencing or your information that's vital for the rest of the world if the outcome of that sharing of information is going to be punitive travel measures.
Dr. Bogoch, one final question over here. You know, all over the world, there's been this huge debate over the last couple of years on herd immunity versus trying to ensure that every last citizen, every last individual is protected. And there have been many critics of herd immunity saying that's not the way to go. But at the end of the day, and if you look at the situation here in India, where we had lockdowns, but only a limited number of lockdowns, there is a sense now that there is a large amount of natural immunity. Add to that vaccines and boosters, and people are relatively well protected. Is there a case, therefore, that herd immunity is what really will save millions of lives? And that's exactly what China has perhaps not followed.
Well, I prefer the term community level protection or community level immunity. And I think it's important to start with the goal is to prevent people from getting infected. We know the virus can be devastating, especially to vulnerable individuals, particularly those on the older end of the spectrum. And we've seen time and time again what happens when the virus rips through communities. Almost every place on the planet has suffered terrible outbreaks and stretched healthcare systems. So the goal is, of course, immunity through vaccination, and that is by far the safest mechanism. Having said that, fully appreciate that the vaccines are do much less now compared to earlier in terms of stopping infection. They can reduce the risk, just not nearly as much, but they do protect against more serious manifestations of the virus. Mm-hmm. We also have to acknowledge, while we don't want people to be infected, we can't ignore that the vast majority of the planet has been infected and recovered from that infection. And yes, of course, that provides degree of protection. And in fact, when we combine vaccination plus recovery from infection, again, stating that we don't want people to be infected, we just can't ignore it. You combine those two, you have what we call hybrid immunity, which appears to be pretty robust protection against more severe manifestations of the virus.